So up next, we have Peter Bryant. So Peter Bryant is the Head of Learning, Technology and Innovation at London School of Economics. Now, he was also a presenter at our global conference in London, so it's a real honor to have him back on stage. So without further ado, I'd like to introduce Peter to the stage. Thank you.
Thank you very much, everyone, for having me back again, which is always a rare treat. As you might notice, I'm from the London School of Economics. We're a global institution that focuses primarily on the area of social sciences. And one of the great challenges for modern universities, as Alan just mentioned, is the capability to not just create knowledge within the walls of the institution, but to generate the capacity for everyone else to make knowledge. And I'm going to talk about a project we ran last year that was designed to do that particular thing using crowdsourcing. So let's start with what the proposition actually was. One of the academics came to us a few years back and said, hey, look, we got this great idea. The UK doesn't have a constitution. Why don't we use the crowd to make one? Fairly good idea. It's been done in other countries before. What he would have liked is that this constitution was going to be delivered by the crowd that represented the community, ensured that it clearly represented the will of the British people, or the people involved in the project. It needed to be done before the 2015 election, and we now know why. We needed to make sure that it was civil and engaging, that it wasn't what a lot of, particularly around digital citizenship and sort of civic engagement projects, can become a little bit messy. And it will provide an educational experience that doesn't actually look like a constitutional law course. Because to be honest, constitutional law to even constitutional law scholars is as boring as it gets. So we wanted this to be interesting. We don't want people reading a book about how to make a constitution. We wanted people to actually do it. So our first challenge was to build a cohesive community. This is not easy. And in the era of Brexit, which I now apologise for on behalf of the British people, and as you might tell from my accent, I'm not actually British, so that probably doesn't really count a lot. We needed to build a cohesive community. We needed to build a group of people who could constructively debate difficult, problematic, sometimes controversial issues with as much passion as was required, and that it didn't degenerate into this. Because that's what happens with a lot of crowdsourced civic engagement projects. It's easy to degenerate into Facebook memes, although I do like most of those. It's easy to degenerate into Facebook memes, into Donald J. Trump on Twitter saying that he's going to be Mr. Brexit. The one up there with the crying baby I got sent when I put a fairly constructive piece about how unhappy I was about leaving the EU. That's what someone responded to me about. How did we stop this happening? How do we stop when we build a community of people who want to come together to talk about something that's actually fundamentally important to their existence as human beings? How do we bring them together in a constructive way? And that was the critical challenge, along with the fact we wanted to make sure that everyone learned. John Seely Brown's an American who writes a lot about what it means to live in a digital age, and particularly to learn in a digital age. And one of his most powerful things he talks about is that the real learning that can happen happens when you're in a community. Not when you're by yourself, sitting in a room, looking at a computer, reading a textbook, looking at notes. It's about being part of a community. And that is not superficial learning, that's deep learning, because it's about experience. One of my favorite people who talks about this is a completely wacky Canadian by the name of Stephen Downes. If you ever look him up, he looks exactly like David Crosby from Crosby, Stills and Nash. Almost spitting image. He won't admit that. But what he talks a lot about is the idea about being connected, and how much you learn from forming and being part of networks and being part of communities. Yes, you can read a book. But when someone else talks to you about reading that book, and then someone else engages with you about their view on that book, and then they talk about their view of someone else talking about it, it becomes really, really powerful. Just as a brief, quick story on this. When I used to work at a university called the University of Greenwich, one of the most tragic things that happened to that university was the murder of a young black student by the name of Stephen Lawrence. Anyone who's British will probably remember the Stephen Lawrence case. He was murdered at a bus stop. just outside the university. He was a major part of that university. He was a student there. His mother worked at the university. And one of the law classes wanted to talk about the Stephen Lawrence case because it talked about community justice. It talked about whether police were biased against young black children. It was a very powerfully emotive example to use. In a lecture theatre this size, no one talked about it. The academic could not get them to talk, to discuss. So he said, okay, here's a simple thing. Go back, talk to your friends on Facebook, ask them their opinion. Came back the next week, he could not shut the lecture theatre up because everyone was going, well, I asked my friend about it and my friend said this and then it became a much more engaged conversation. The second challenge we have is that most learning looks like this. Most learning is scaffolded. It's sequential. You've got to do week 1 before you do week 2. It's aligned. It means that everything that you learn has to be assessed in a particular way. It's very structured. You can't come in week 3 or week 4. You actually have to start at the beginning and you have to learn to crawl before you can walk. And it's also very stratified. We have undergraduate, we have postgraduate, we have postdoctoral, we have doctoral, we have further education, higher education. It's a very, very structured system. And at the end of that, one of the things that universities all do is that we certify this knowledge. We say to you, you've learnt, here's a certificate, here's a diploma, here's a degree. And that's the way we structure our entire educational experience. Trouble is, life doesn't often work like that. And the way we choose to live our life, share our life, acquire, connect, change, grow knowledge is rarely that connected. One of the things that my university talks a lot about is that we are very much about preparing people for employment. We are a major institution that trains a lot of the financial sector, we train a lot of the law sector, we train a lot of some of the great economists in the world. But we also, whilst we do try and train skills around those things, we also train them in a way that perhaps they will never use those skills. Will they ever sit in a room again, for example, and write up 4 essays in a 3-hour exam? Probably not. So, what would happen if a higher education experience wasn't like that? I'm not critical of that. I've been teaching in higher education now for 25 years. That's kind of my bread and butter and a bit of money out of it. So that's good. So I don't want to sort of, throw the baby out with the bathwater. But what happens if you could do it in a different way? That it was informal, it was community-led. So instead of being led by an academic, it was led by the community. That it was non-linear. You didn't have to start at the beginning before you got to the end. That it was democratic. That it was about problem solving, not just knowledge exchange. That it was collaborative. In fact, it could even be chaotic. It could be aspirational, it's emancipatory, and it's open. And that was the challenge we set ourselves. How do we make an educational experience look like that in a higher education institution that's completely rusted on to do it the other way? And we wanted to do it at a massive scale, not 5 or 10. We wanted to do it large scale. We're quite a small institution. We only have about 9,500 students. But we wanted to do this as big as we could make it. And we wanted to use social media to do it because we don't want to put them all in a room. We don't want to have a 1,000-seat lecture theatre and fill it with people to try and do this. So what did we do? We created, using an ideation platform called Crowdsourcing, a community that brought together a combination of learning approaches. This was not about Constitutional Law 101. This was not about delivering materials that someone could consume and then in a kind of, echo chamber try and apply that. We wanted to integrate a whole lot of participatory practices. This wasn't just about talking. What our participants did was they came up with clauses for a constitution, they debated those clauses, they voted on those clauses, they refined them, and at the end of the day, that's what they needed to do to create a constitution. There were no readings, there were no course materials, no course packs, there wasn't a lecturer or a teacher, there was a guru, without a doubt. Professor Connor Getty, one of the country's leading constitutional scholars, was involved in this project as a kind of guru. He came in, he popped in, he would look at a comment that someone said and said, well, why'd you say that? But he wouldn't do lectures. There was no sequence you could enter at any time. The project ran for 14 weeks, and there were people who said some of the most important things in week 14, and that was their first week. We did have methods to try and keep people up. We used Storify, we used Twitter to try and keep people up to date with what was going on, but we never tried to say, well, if you weren't there in week 1, you couldn't come in later. What was great through the whole process from every person who was involved in it was that learning was an expectation. That probably came from the idea that we were a university running it, but learning was an expectation. And people said they learnt through being part of that community. They didn't learn from us. They didn't learn from the professor that was the guru. They learnt from each other by participating actively in citizenship. So, not a huge community in terms of, you talk about Coursera and some of their courses with hundreds of thousands of people. We had about 1,500 users. That was growing all the way through. It never declined. In fact, our numbers in sort of reverse order to traditional online education grew every week. We submitted 725 ideas. There were 125,000 views of that, nearly 1 million words written. 75% of people learnt something and 88% of people were influenced by their community. But what was most important is they wrote an 8,500 word constitution as a group of 1,500 people representing a very diverse range of people in the country. And what was even better about it was that we had no fights, no poor behaviour. I mean, when you're debating something that's as passionate, for example, as the European human rights and the role of European human rights in the UK, nothing. We just had a really engaged debate. Granted, there was one person who threatened Connor with treason for doing this, but we just took that in its best nature. So for us, what did this project do? This idea of crowdsourcing a constitution. We wanted to redefine what it meant to be part of a massive. A massive isn't a number. A massive isn't, wow, we've got 100,000 people. A massive is a collective set of intelligence, a collective set of passions, and a collective set of impact potential. It creates ripples. No, of course 1,500 people all didn't debate a single clause, but they talked about it with their friends and their communities. The power of the massive to analyse, to understand, to come up with solutions to problems that we didn't think possible. And what does it mean to be part of that massive? What does it mean to be a member of a group of people and the experience that that generates? 51% of people who were in that community said to us at the end of it, what we really want is to do this again, because that experience was really a powerful one. From an education perspective, we wanted to redesign what it meant to be open. This was an open community. Anyone can join. You didn't have to be British. You didn't have to be over 18. You didn't have to have any knowledge of constitutional law. But you had to be willing to participate in the solution to the problem. And that changes the nature of a university. Most universities are quite closed. The knowledge sits within that university. That's slowly shifting now in terms of modern approaches to research knowledge, but most of them are quite closed. This is a chance to open up those walls. And we also wanted to redesign what it meant to be participatory, to be a part of this. We were interested in the emancipatory aspect of this. This is a group of people who probably never would have had anything to do with constitutional law. They had a constitution handed to the Speaker of the British Parliament in a slightly naff red box and said to him, there you go, there's a constitution, done. It also gave the notion that participation is authority, the ability to influence and change. And the power of these connections is fleeting. These were not lasting connections. These are things that just, almost like ships in a night, glancing past each other. But the power that comes from fleeting connections. This comes from a paper that we published about the project. But to me, the most important part about this is, what did these people bring to the project? They brought user-generated content. They brought their words and ideas. They brought collaborative learning. They brought network formation. They brought critical inquiry. This wasn't just like, oh, I think the Queen should go. Bleh. It was a reason why that should happen and some thought about it. It built relationship building. We asked every single person who had an idea that people liked to actually engage with their community to refine that idea, make it better. It didn't just stop at the idea. They had to take ownership of that idea and develop it. And it's also a literacy. What does it mean to engage in a civic inquiry across a massive community? So I'll leave you with those 3 questions to ponder yourself, and for us to talk about what we're doing next. Funnily enough, we've just been funded to do Mark 2 of this, which will be looking at the issue of youth and Brexit and the EU. So it's quite timely. So thank you very much. I'll be around all day if you want to ask me some questions.
Thank you, Peter. Does anyone have any questions at all? Gentleman here.
Hi. I'm from the UK, and since Brexit and even before, I haven't been to your group that you set up, but I have been to about 3 or 4, not ones on constitution, but about discussing after Brexit and all the issues. And seeing that we're at a crowdsourcing event, for me the frustration has been that going to 3 to 5 different segregated groups which are fundamentally trying to achieve the same thing. Do you think through your group that it's possible to crowdsource all the other groups together and save time? Is that something, a fair question to ask?
It is probably a fair question to ask, and you're right, and that is one of the problems, I think, that it's a 1,500 strong community, so we're not talking, there's millions and millions of citizens who could have participated. There does need to be someone that brings it together. Now, whether that's a university that does that, whether that's a government that actually wants to bring these things together to have an engaged debate, whether that is the third sector. I spoke at the National Council of Voluntary Organisations conference about this, and there are 3 or 4 groups that actually have that intention. But there's 3 or 4 groups who have that intention, they're not talking to each other. It kind of comes back to my horrible riff of the last 2016, which is the desperate need for leadership. But I'm not sure who provides that.
Okay, thank you. That's been really great.
Thank you, Peter, for your presentation.
Thank you.